Now to those rising tensions on the streets of Hong Kong. Police and protesters going into an 11th week of clashes as gathering Chinese forces loom across the border.
Tensions mounting in Hong Kong.
Protesters surrounded a police station earlier, and now you can see the riot police have come out in force.
Traffic cones, suitcases, and laser pointers. These are just some of the objects that have been made into tactical gear by demonstrators in Hong Kong.
We won't go home. We won't until we have victory at last.
This was Hong Kong 4 years ago. Millions of people took to the street to protest against the CCP and to fight for Hong Kong's freedom. The numbers of protesters kept growing by the day. The movement reached every corner of the world, and it seemed like, for the first time in almost forever, that the will of the people may actually win. But after a while, most of the world just kind of forgot. But the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping didn't forget. In June of 2022, Hong Kong held a big parade for the 25th anniversary of the handover. But this wasn't just a party, it was a clear message. Speaking to a hand-picked crowd, Xi Jinping said, "And after the wind and rain, Hong Kong has risen from the ashes." What he really meant was that Hong Kong was no longer the free city it once was. Beijing's control was now stronger than ever. But this moment didn't just happen overnight. It was the result of years of careful moves by Beijing to slowly take away Hong Kong's freedoms, one piece at a time. The changes had already started earlier. In 2021, Beijing completely changed Hong Kong's voting system. Now only people who were loyal to the CCP could run for office. This made many politicians powerless to fight back. Then in 2024, a new version of the national security law gave the government even more power to silence anyone who disagreed. Activists were thrown in jail. Independent news outlets like Apple Daily and Stand News were shut down. Unions and community groups were forced to close. Step by step, Beijing made it harder for anyone to speak out. Thousands of students, professionals, and activists decided to leave Hong Kong. Those who stayed found it almost impossible to resist. But we will not stop fighting for Hong Kongers' freedom and independence. The CCP is usually not happy about small news channels exposing their lies, but with your support, we will continue to fight CCP's $30 billion a year propaganda budget. You can support us in this fight by hitting the like button and the subscribe button down below. It really does help us expose the truth about the CCP to more people. We thank you. By early 2025, the effects of Beijing's control of Hong Kong could be seen everywhere. The crackdown wasn't just about stopping protests. It was about completely taking over Hong Kong. The new National Security Office played a leading role, showing that Hong Kong's leaders now answered directly to Beijing. Civil servants had to take loyalty oaths. Even the last bit of local democracy, the district council elections, were cancelled. Beijing had fully broken the promise of one country, two systems. What was left was just an empty slogan. The freedoms that once made Hong Kong special were almost completely gone. Beijing made its position very clear. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Guo Zhaokun said, "Hong Kong is China's Hong Kong and brooks no outside interference." At the same time, China placed sanctions on US lawmakers and human rights groups, trying to push back against US efforts to hold Hong Kong officials responsible for crushing freedoms. Meanwhile, China's state-run media was working hard to change the story. They painted the United States not as a defender of democracy, but as a fading superpower, trying to hang on to its influence. All of this happened while the US and China were fighting a tough trade war. US tariffs on Chinese goods reached 145%, and China hit back with 125% tariffs of its own. This made global markets nervous. But for Hong Kong, the bigger problem was political. With its democracy destroyed and its reputation as a global financial hub slipping away, Hong Kong was losing the identity it had built over many decades. Once a proud symbol of freedom and success, Hong Kong had now become a clear example of the CCP's growing hunger for expansion. So today, let's go over how the CCP took over Hong Kong while the whole world was distracted. To really understand why Hong Kong had its own government, separate from China for so long, you have to go back to the 1800s, a time when powerful countries from Europe were taking parts of Asia for themselves. It all started when Britain forced China to hand over some coastal areas after the Opium Wars. And let's be clear, China didn't agree willingly. Britain used its strong military to force China to sign unfair deals. The main reason for the conflict was Britain's opium trade. Britain was making a lot of money selling opium, a highly addictive drug, to China. But the Chinese emperor saw that millions of his people were getting addicted, and it was hurting the country badly. Some say about 90 million out of the 300 million people in China were hooked on opium. It wasn't just a health problem, it was destroying the economy as well. The emperor tried to stop the opium trade, but Britain didn't want to lose its profits. This led to two wars, the First and the Second Opium Wars, with France joining Britain in the Second War. Because Britain and France had stronger armies, they forced China to agree to humiliating peace terms. One major result? After the First Opium Wars ended in 1842, Britain took control of Hong Kong Island. Later, after the Second Opium War, they grabbed even more land, including a 99-year lease on the new territory starting in 1898. Before this all happened, Hong Kong was just a small fishing village, barely noticed by anyone. But under British rule, it changed a lot. The population grew from just a few thousand to millions. Hong Kong became a major international trading hub, partly because it was a free port with close ties to the British Empire. In the early years, opium was still a big part of Hong Kong's economy, but over time, trade expanded to include things like tea and silk. The city's importance in the world grew quickly, but it wasn't always easy. During World War II, Hong Kong was captured by Japan. Life under Japanese occupation was extremely harsh. After the war ended, the British returned and Hong Kong bounced back faster than anyone expected. Meanwhile, things in mainland China were very different. China was struggling under communist rule, while Hong Kong's free market economy was booming. By the 1950s, Hong Kong was a major center for textiles and later for electronics. Along with South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, Hong Kong became known as one of the 4 Asian tigers for its fast-growing economy. British rule left a big mark on Hong Kong. English stayed an important language, and Western culture shaped many things, like the legal system and pop culture. But life under colonial rule wasn't perfect. There were protests and riots in 1956, 1966, 1967, and 1981. Many people believed colonialism was unfair and outdated. Pressure for change kept growing. By the time the 99-year lease was about to end in 1997, it was clear that Britain had to give Hong Kong back to China. But handing it over wasn't simple. Hong Kong had developed a completely different political and economic system from the mainland. People were worried about what would happen under communist rule. So, to calm those fears, Britain and China made a special agreement called One Country, Two Systems. Under this deal, Hong Kong would be a part of China, but it would keep its capitalist economy, political freedoms, and way of life for 50 years, until 2047. These promises were written into the Basic Law, Hong Kong's mini-constitution. The city got its own legislature, its own courts, and its own executive branch. It even kept its own money and financial system. Most importantly, there was the promise that over time, Hong Kong would get free and fair elections. But there was a catch. These democratic changes were supposed to happen gradually, which gave China lots of chances to slow things down and take more control. And that's exactly what happened. Systems like the election committee, which decided who could run for leadership, made sure true democracy stayed out of reach. Over the years, Beijing slowly took away more and more of Hong Kong's freedoms and independence. Before we go into how the CCP is enforcing its control over Hong Kong, we first need to understand why it gave the city its freedom in the first place. After all, Beijing had the right to just take over the territory in one go back in 1997. But the independence of Hong Kong actually has benefits for the mainland. The city is the international gateway for China for foreign investment and finance. Because if we look at the statistics, in 2023, more than 70% of China's utilized foreign direct investment came from Hong Kong, reaching $137 billion in a single year. This has gained steam over the last 2 decades. Now, these billions aren't coming from Hong Kong itself. With a GDP of just $360 billion, it can't possibly send $137 billion a year worth of investments to China. Most of the money actually comes from financial institutions based in other countries, who use Hong Kong as a conduit for China. This has to do with Hong Kong's unique financial system. Although Singapore overtook it in 2022, Hong Kong used to be Asia's financial hub and the 3rd biggest financial center in the world. The reason it was so popular is that the city has its own financial regulations and currency, which makes it more attractive for foreign investors. Both institutions and retail investors prefer not to put their money directly into China, because of the risks that are associated with it. It's not really a free market economy, so there's always the chance that the CCP intervenes. Also, the Chinese government doesn't really welcome foreign investors on the mainland. In order to invest directly, you need licenses, such as the Qualified Foreign Institutional Investor. And even if you obtain such a license, after a long bureaucratic process, you are still subjected to strict CCP guidelines. Because this is such a hassle, much of the investment goes through the Hong Kong Stock Connect and Bond Connect markets. These are financial schemes for Hong Kong investors that make it easy to access the Shenzhen and Shanghai stock exchanges and China's debt markets. But what makes Hong Kong even more appealing as a financial gateway is the currency situation. In order to buy Chinese yuan-denominated assets with US dollars, going through Hong Kong is by far the easiest way. The Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar, which makes transactions very stable. Meanwhile, the Chinese yuan and the US dollar aren't fully convertible due to capital restrictions. However, it's possible to transfer your US dollars into Hong Kong dollars and then convert them into Chinese yuan in Hong Kong. The setup is all on purpose, of course. For the Chinese government, it's a way to get foreign cash without being directly exposed to international currency markets. This shields it from a lot of financial instability and potential crisis. And that role is only amplified by Hong Kong's place at the heart of the Greater Bay Area. The GBA, in short, only helps with its function as an international bank for China. The area houses around 86 million people, with a combined GDP of around 1.9 trillion US dollars. This includes the third and fifth biggest cities in China by GDP, namely Guangzhou and Shenzhen. There are a lot of booming enterprises nearby, and all of them need investment and loans to keep growing. This financial incentive was one of the main reasons why the CCP didn't completely take over the city in 1997. As a strategic conduit, Hong Kong has been one of the key drivers of China's economic rise over the last decades. However, Hong Kong's political freedoms didn't fit into China's interests. Perhaps it was too dangerous for the CCP to have a beacon of free speech and democracy right next door, as the citizens on the mainland could get dangerous ideas. The tension between Hong Kong's hopes for democracy and Beijing's desire to control really started showing in 1991. That year, Hong Kong held its first ever legislative elections as a kind of practice run before the 1997 handover to China. Two main sides quickly formed: the pro-democracy camp, led by Martin Lee's United Democrats, and the pro-Beijing camp, which wanted Hong Kong to have closer ties to mainland China. When the votes were counted, it was a huge win for the United Democrats. For a short, exciting moment, it looked like Hong Kong might actually have a real democratic future. But that hope didn't last long. Over time, problems started to appear. The political system was slowly changing to help people who supported Beijing. They redrew voting districts to give pro-Beijing candidates an advantage. They also created special voting groups called functional constituencies, and quietly put loyalists into important government jobs. Little by little, the dream of true democracy for regular people was kind of being chipped away. To really understand how Hong Kong's democracy was taken apart, you have to take a look at the system put in place after 1997. At the center of all of it was the chief executive, the city's top leader. You might think of the chief executive like a president, but with a big difference. The chief executive isn't chosen by the people. Instead, they're picked by a group called the Election Committee. Most members of this committee aren't elected by regular voters. They come from business groups, professional associations, and political organizations, most of which are very close to Beijing. The Legislative Council, or LegCo, had similar problems. It was supposed to pass laws, approve budgets, and keep the government in check. But the way members were chosen made that hard. Out of 60 seats, only 20 were chosen by the people. Another 30 were picked by the functional constituencies, special interest groups, and the last 10 were chosen by the election committee. This setup gave a lot of power to the elites, not to everyday citizens. And this wasn't by accident. The system was designed on purpose to let Beijing control Hong Kong politics from behind the scenes. Many of the business and professional groups had strong reasons to stay friendly with Beijing. After all, China is Hong Kong's biggest trading partner, and trade and services flowing through Hong Kong are worth about 4 times the city's entire economy. If you ran a big company, keeping Beijing happy was basically necessary to survive. It's a lot easier to control a few hundred insiders than millions of regular voters. That's where the Hong Kong Liaison's office comes in. Hidden away in a cold, glassy building, this office acts as China's main base in Hong Kong. Its job is to build relationships with pro-Beijing politicians, plan elections, and quietly make sure the right people get into office. They also fund political campaigns, run several big newspapers, and own Hong Kong's largest book publisher. Behind closed doors, there are a lot of stories about secret deals, special favors, and sometimes even bribes to keep powerful people loyal to Beijing. The problems with the system became super clear during the 1998 legislative elections. the first after Hong Kong returned to China. Even though the pro-democracy side won about 2/3 of the public vote, they only got about 1/3 of the seats in Legco. For many Hong Kongers, this felt like a total betrayal. It showed that the system was clearly stacked against them. And as the years went on, people's anger kept growing. They remembered the promises made in the Basic Law, that one day Hong Kong would have a real democracy. But it became more and more obvious that Beijing wasn't planning to let that happen. The growing gap between the promises and reality made tensions rise. And eventually, all that frustration exploded, leading to the huge protests and fierce fights over Hong Kong's future that the world would see in the years to come. There had already been annual protests every July 1st, marking the anniversary of Hong Kong's handover to China. But in 2003, things went to a whole new level. That year, 500,000 people showed up for the march. They were angry about the new security law that would make things like treason and trying to break away from China illegal. With so many people protesting, the government had to put the law on hold, for now. Tensions flared up again in 2005. This time, the pro-Beijing government tried to change the way elections worked. But the changes didn't really matter. The same powerful groups would still control things, and real democracy wasn't on the table. The pro-democracy camp wanted real changes, not just small fixes. In December that year, tens of thousands of people took to the streets again to protest. Thanks to all the public pressure, the government blocked the reforms. But this was just a temporary win. The deeper problems were still there, and Hong Kongers were still waiting for the promised democratic changes. But Beijing, they weren't in any rush to make things better. In 2007, China ruled that Hong Kong wouldn't be allowed to directly elect its chief executive until 2017. And its legislative council wouldn't be able to elect members directly until at least 2020. During this time, pro-democracy groups, pro-Beijing groups, and the liaison office kept having long, frustrated talks. Some pro-democracy lawmakers were so frustrated that they resigned, hoping this would trigger a by-election and force a vote on democracy. But the plan didn't work. Voter turnout was low, and even some pro-democracy members didn't support the idea. There was a bit of hope in 2010 when a new electoral reform plan passed. It made the election committee bigger and gave voters a bit more influence over the legislative council through district-based elections. But many Hong Kongers felt like these changes were just to calm the public down, not a real step towards democracy. Unelected officials still held a lot of power, and the elections were still set up to favor the pro-Beijing side. Many people still hoped that 2017 would bring real change. But in August of 2014, Beijing crushed that hope when it announced its plan for the 2017 chief executive election. Hong Kongers would be able to vote directly, but only for candidates that were approved by a special committee. This committee was basically the same as the old election committee, filled with business elites and people close to the Chinese government. In other words, the system was still rigged to keep Beijing in control. The reaction was immediate. People were furious, and this led to the 2014 Umbrella Movement. Starting in September, students and young activists took over major roads and intersections, demanding real democratic reforms. But the pro-Beijing government showed its more aggressive side. Police used tear gas against peaceful protesters, and some criminal gangs even attacked the demonstrators. The Umbrella Movement marked a big change. It sparked a deep political divide that lasted for years. A new generation of young Hong Kongers lost faith in its government, while the Beijing camp blamed foreign countries for interfering and said the protests were a breakdown of order. For the next few years, there was a return to stability, but none of the divisions were solved. It was bound to go wrong again, and it did in 2019. The Hong Kong government proposed a controversial extradition bill, allowing for fugitives to be transferred to China, Macau, and Taiwan. What this really meant was that the enemies of the CCP could expect to spend the rest of their life in a Chinese prison. Basically, an extradition agreement would mean that people in Hong Kong are subject to CCP laws. Because this absolutely demolished any hopes of free speech, many students took to the streets again, and others followed. The first pro-democracy protests began in March of 2019, and they continued for more than a year. On several occasions, hundreds of thousands of people were protesting at the same time. The biggest protest occurred on the 16th of June 2019, where organizers estimated 2 million people went to the streets. That would be about 30% of the entire city's population. One of the most violent protests was the storming of the Legislative Council complex in July of 2019. People broke through glass walls and doors and entered the government building in order to prevent the extradition bill from being passed. The damage done during the storming led to a shutdown of the complex for 3 months. They succeeded in their objective as the chief executive announced the bill was quote-unquote dead, and it was delayed indefinitely. Even though the immediate threat of the extradition bill was over, the protests continued. With the momentum built up, people demonstrated for other demands too. There were 5 to be precise. The first one had to do with the definitive withdrawal of the extradition bill, so that the legislative process couldn't be resumed. Protesters also wanted the current chief executive to resign and a new directly elected government. The third and fourth demands were accountability for the police behavior during the protests and the release of the protesters arrested due to their political beliefs. Additionally, they demanded that peaceful protest shouldn't be treated as riots by the government. Inspired by the Baltic Way protests of 1989, where people in the Baltic states formed a human chain of 2 million people, Hong Kongers organized the Hong Kong Way protest. In August of 2019, an estimated 210,000 people formed a chain of more than 30 miles. That's 50 kilometers. Because of the large backing among students, there were also huge protests on university campuses. This created clashes between student protesters and riot police at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. The last one was occupied by the pro-democracy camp, which led to a police siege and storming. Protesters threw bricks and petrol bombs, and the police used tear gas and rubber bullets. There were also cases of police brutality, exactly the thing that people were protesting against. An example of this was the Prince Edward Metro Station incident, where the police indiscriminately attacked passengers and arrested protesters. Still, there were also people opposed to the protesters and in favor of the government. They organized pro-Beijing protests, such as the Safeguard Hong Kong rally. Some were wearing blue ribbons in support of the police force. The two groups of protesters often clashed. People tore down pro-democracy posters and graffiti. One extremist even attacked protesters with a knife, while others rammed their cars into crowds of demonstrators. There were also instances where villagers and supposed gang members ambushed groups with wooden sticks and metal rods. The most well-known incident was the 2019 Yuan Long attack, where a group of men in white t-shirts attacked protesters at a metro station, causing tens of injuries. They could have been vigilante groups who felt that the police weren't being hard-handed enough, but the more likely explanation is that these people were hired by the pro-Beijing camp. Either way, it was clear on whose side the police were on. Despite 24,000 emergency calls, the police force didn't show up on time, and they made no arrests. However, the pro-democracy side was also not innocent. A pro-Beijing lawmaker called Junius Ho was stabbed and his family's graves desecrated. This was allegedly a retaliation for the Yuan Long attack, where the lawmaker would have played a role, and apolitical citizens of Hong Kong were also victims. A 70-year-old resident died because of a fatal head injury when pro-democracy protesters were throwing bricks. Amidst all this chaos, Hong Kong held local elections in November of 2019. Many people saw this as a referendum about the extradition bill. The voter turnout was record-breaking, with 71% of registered voters casting their vote. And the pro-democracy parties won with a historic landslide. They got nearly 90% of the total seats in the directly elected district council, with 388 out of 452 seats. The following COVID pandemic drew the attention away for a few months, but in May of 2020, perhaps the most important development of all happened. Following the election result, the Chinese authorities began drafting a new law to be implemented in the Hong Kong Basic Law. Yes, the CCP can actually do that. There's some sort of intentional loophole where China can add a new law to Hong Kong's constitution by way of a promulgation. Sounds complicated, but it's actually relatively simple. When the chief executive publishes the new legislator in the government newspaper, the law is immediately in effect. There's no voting process, and the chief executive is always a pro-Beijing politician by design. So that's exactly what happened on the 21st of May, 2020. Suddenly, there was a new national security law, which made secession, foreign interference, terrorism, and subversion against the central government illegal. In other words, it gave the CCP and the pro-Beijing government more than enough room to arrest and criminalize any opposition. By the way, the CCP already tried to get this law through in 2003, right in the middle of the SARS outbreak. Funny how they always try to push these things during a novel coronavirus outbreak. Perhaps it gives an excuse to prevent mass protests, as it will be a public health hazard. Anyway, with these new powers at their disposal, the pro-Beijing government and the CCP continued their crackdown on opposition. In the next legislative election, 12 candidates for the pro-democracy side were banned. According to a government spokesperson, they sought secession from China and intervention from foreign governments. With the new national security law, those things have become illegal. The Chinese authorities went even further in November of 2020. They passed a new resolution saying that the Hong Kong executives can remove legislators in the Legislative Council. 4 sitting pro-democracy legislators were immediately disqualified. and their 15 colleagues resigned in protest. Meanwhile, the Hong Kong authorities used the national security law to crack down on activists and protesters. Since the imposition of the law, 299 people have been arrested. This includes a lot of high-profile people who were obviously the first target of the CCP. Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow, both activists turned politicians, had to spend some time in jail for violating national security. Another arrest, which made headlines all over the world, is that of Jimmy Lai. He was a businessman and a politician, and one of the most powerful pro-democracy figures in the whole city. Jimmy Lai got rich with a clothing retail company and moved into the media business later. His media company, Next Digital, became the largest media company in Hong Kong, largely due to the popular Apple Daily newspaper. This news outlet was very critical of the Chinese government, as was Jimmy Lai. The billionaire was one of the main donors to the Democratic Party of Hong Kong. Lai was obviously a big target for the CCP, and he was arrested in 2020 and jailed in 2021. As of writing this video, he's been locked up for 3 years and is facing a life sentence. When the leaders of the resistance movement are removed and jailed, the rest of the protesters lose confidence. This is authoritarianism 101. In this way, the CCP managed to crush any hopes of a return to democracy. With the reduced public resistance, Beijing's plan continued. Before the 2021 legislative elections, the Chinese authorities made some sweeping reforms. Only patriots loyal to China could run, and the number of directly elected seats was drastically reduced. Only 20 out of the 90 seats could now be chosen by the people, and the directly elected district councils had significantly less powers in the new system. Now it was clear to everyone, Hong Kong wasn't a democracy anymore, but a vassal state to the CCP. And consistently, for about 3 years, the crackdown on Hong Kong's opposition just kept going. In June of 2022, Xi Jinping visited Hong Kong to mark the 25th anniversary of the handover. But it wasn't just a regular visit. It felt like a celebration for Beijing. It was also Xi's first trip outside mainland China since the COVID pandemic. During his speech, Xi said, "After the wind and rain, Hong Kong has risen from the ashes." What he really meant was that all the resistance to Beijing's rule had been crushed. A few days later, Xi attended the ceremony for Hong Kong's new chief executive. This followed an election where only about 30% of eligible voters participated, and all the candidates were pro-Beijing. During the ceremony, Xi made it clear, from now on, only patriots would be allowed to govern Hong Kong. But Beijing wasn't finished yet. In 2024, the pro-Beijing government kept making things worse. Many activists from the 2019 protests were still being arrested and charged. Those who had fled the city weren't safe either. Hong Kong authorities put bounties of $1 million Hong Kong dollars on some exiled activists. Then in March, lawmakers passed a tougher version of the national security law. Under this new law, people convicted of serious crimes like treason, rebellion, or working with foreign countries could be sentenced to life in prison. Smaller crimes like working with outsiders could lead to 2 to 3 years in jail, and espionage could lead up to 20 years. The worst part is that inciting hatred of the CCP is now punishable by up to 10 years in jail. This is especially dangerous because it's so vague. Anyone who criticizes the government could be targeted. By now, the idea of one country, two systems has almost no meaning. Hong Kong's freedom, it's just a cover. Real power is fully in Beijing's hand, and for the people of Hong Kong, the future feels uncertain. The little freedom they once had is gone, and they now have even less control over their lives than they did before 1997. If we look to the future, the picture is also not very bright. Hong Kong's little sovereignty will end in 2047, exactly 50 years after the handover to China. As flawed and dysfunctional as it was, the two systems idea was arguably better than direct CCP rule, and it doesn't look like the CCP will grant Hong Kong an additional few years of self-governance. Because of the increased competition with the US, Beijing has become less tolerant towards things like democracy and free speech. The risk that an independent Hong Kong will align itself with the US is just too big. So with the knowledge that Hong Kong has only 23 years left, there are only two things that the city's inhabitants can do. They can either flee using a British visa program, or they can wait and see what life is like under the authoritarian regime of the CCP. Thanks for watching. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel, or a faceless YouTube channel like this one, well, now's the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure many of you have questions on how to get started and how to grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one training boot camp for the low, low price of completely free. So, if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can sign up for this bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or on the screen. Sign up now because, unfortunately, unlike YouTube videos, the bootcamp is like a Zoom call, so it's limited to just 100 people. Okay, let's get back to the video.